Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today. My name is Wendy Bray, and I have here with my colleague, here today with me, my colleague, Curtis Brandon. A few housekeeping notes. This training is being recorded, and a copy of the presentation, a copy of the recording will be sent out to you within 24 hours. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel. I have opened the Q&A and the chat box. So for all questions that you have, please direct them to the Q&A box. Please do not direct them to one individual, but to the panelists and the host altogether. So we can ensure that we collect everyone's questions that you have to ensure that we're responding to them. The chat box is open for everyone to be able to communicate with each other as far as networking goes. This session is for 2 hours, and we have planned for breaks throughout. After this event concludes, a survey will appear. I want to ask that you please provide your feedback concerning this training for today. Your responses will be used as part of our continual service improvement effort. Partnering with other businesses presents an opportunity for small businesses to combine capabilities and past performance when competing for large, complex contracts. Today, our speakers, whom I will introduce shortly, will be discussing the operation perspective of teaming strategies, the importance of teaming, limitations of subcontracting, why you should use a teaming agreement, along with a lot more valuable information. This is phase 1 of 2. So I recommend that you subscribe to our OSDBU. It's on our OSDBU homepage to receive notification when registration opens for phase 2. Jackie Lopez is an innovative and results-driven information technology executive and founder of Premier Enterprise Solutions, LLC, which is a health information technology, intelligence, and program management company that provides support for federal agencies such as VA, Air Force, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, USAID, DHS, and HHS. She's responsible for executing Premier's strategic directive, revenue generation, and ensuring that Premier delivers on its promises. She's a former U.S. Air Force officer. Jackie has over 30 years of public and private sector experience in the information technology industry that includes serving as the Director of Defense Programs at GSA FedSim Center and president of another small business prior to starting Premier. She's passionate about entrepreneurship and deeply committed to mentoring and community service. Ms. Lopez is a graduate of the VA OSDBU Women Veteran-Owned Small Business Initiative, WASB, and the Montgomery County Veterans Institute for Procurement Grow program. Ms. Lopez was also honored as one of the top 100 women in Maryland by the Maryland Daily Record. Premier's local and national acknowledgments as a fast-growing company includes Washington Technology's Fast 50, the Inc. 5000 for 3 consecutive years, and the D'Anello Institute for Veterans and Military Families, IVMF, Vet 100 Award for 2 consecutive years. Shane is an equity partner at Koprince McCall Pottroff LLC and editor of the Small GovCon Federal Contracting Legal blog. He is co-author of the recently published GovCon Handbook Joint Ventures, a guide to government contracts, joint ventures agreements, 2nd edition. Shane is also the author of GovCon Handbook Volume 5, Procedures and Pitfalls of Size Protests and Appeals. He assists small businesses in federal acquisition regulation and small business administration compliance issues, transactional issues such as joint ventures and teaming agreements, and regularly litigates GAO bid protests, size, and status protests, including under the SDVOSB program and claims. Shane's writing on small business government contracting matters can regularly be found at Small GovCon, and his work has appeared in Contract Management magazine. He speaks on government contracting issues to audiences around the country. So now I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Jackie, so we can get started.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction and just wanted to say good afternoon to everyone. And as in the slide, before we get started, just understand that we're presenting some strategies and principles and examples that are not necessarily for specific individual use, individualized, to be construed as individualized operational or legal advice, because obviously we do not know each and every one of your companies, but understand that you can feel free to tailor this information for your specific circumstances, and continue to check on the tools, on the advice that we give you so that you'll always be updated. Next slide. That being said, Shane and I are very excited about the opportunity to share really real world proven teaming strategies and principles and key legal information that you really need to support successful partnering. We want you to be successful. We want to help you both enhance and maximize your partnering experience. Let me say up front, this particular webinar does not include JVs or mentor protege, the mentor protege program. We will be covering that in a subsequent webinar, but today the focus is prime and subcontractor agreements. Next slide. So first part is going to be, I'll talk on partnering strategies from an operational perspective. And this is going to address partnering in a manner that maximizes your return on investment and helps you to identify great potential partners as well as vet them. And then we'll give you some resources and tools to do forensics on potential partners. Next slide. Before I really delve into it, I have to give you two keys to success that I think are very important. I think they're important to what we're talking about here. I think they're important for anything else you really want to use. One is that you have to be 100% responsible for your company. What does that mean? That means don't allow circumstances, people, and events outside of your business to be an excuse for not achieving your goals. There will always be government procurement rules. Your BD people don't do the right things. There are competitors that have an unfair advantage. Your proposal writer dropped the ball. Things happen. I totally get that. But everyone I've seen who's really successful, the focus is not on what's wrong, but it's on how do I fix it? How do I move ahead? What is my solution? So the buck always stops with you. So focus on problem solving rather than blaming, criticizing, or complaining. Next slide. This is a success challenge. Now, I give you this because for me, this is something, a key I learned a few years ago from a business book that someone was wonderful enough to give me. And when I heard about, I'm responsible, it's like, sure, I know that I'm responsible, right? The buck stops with me, the complaining, the criticizing, complaining. And the exercise was just do it for 1 week. Go 1 week without blaming, criticizing, and complaining. And again, I was like, I'm already responsible. Are you kidding me? I'm a former military. I can do anything. So I decide, okay, I will try this. I'm not a whiny person. I can do this. 1 hour later, when I tried this exercise, I found myself complaining about something. And I thought, well, okay, I'm just, getting accustomed to it. So a couple of hours later, I found myself complaining again. This is so much more difficult than it was so much more difficult than I'd ever imagined. However, fast forward a few years, and I've learned so much from continuously going through and doing this exercise. And it's because of this that I am now very much solution focused rather than problem focused. And it saves me so much time at the end of the day because it cuts down not only on the time that I take to solve problems, but also my anxiety level. And, we have a lot to be anxious and stressful about in this business. So I'm just saying, instead, when you catch yourself doing that, ask yourself, how do I contribute to this situation? How can I grow from this situation? And what needs improvement? Next slide. The second key is being strategic. Take the longer view. Understand where you're going and why. This is really critical to setting clear and very realistic goals for your business. Think about your vision, your plan, your roadmap, what people, what processes, what technologies it takes for your company to grow and get to where you want it to be in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. Where is that? How do you get there? And when you have that strategy in mind, again, it helps you to focus and it helps your return on investment, which we'll continue to talk about. Next slide. Partnering definition. For the purposes, again, of this briefing, we're talking about prime and subcontractor relationships. And we're talking about partnering with strategic considerations from a strategic perspective where you collaborate in order to increase your probability of win, whether you're the prime or the sub. And I know a lot of us want to be prime. Everybody wants to be prime. I think that's fantastic. But just keep in mind that the goal at the end of the day really is to win. The goal, especially if you're brand new to the game or you're trying to grow, it really is, well, even when you get larger, it is always to win at the end of the day. When I started out, I had everything that I needed to win an opportunity, but I was brand new in my company. I didn't have any vehicles. I didn't have any past performance. I had everything I needed to win a project. By the time I brought in all the partners I needed, I only got 15%, though almost everything involved in it was my deal. However, that 15% gave me profitability that I needed to begin to do other things, and it gave me cyber past performance that I needed in order to continue to grow in the cyberspace. Next slide. Why partnering is important. Partnering is a tool to maximize your return on investment. Business is all about maximizing revenue and minimizing your expenses. That's why you have to look at everything you do in business and understand why and what is your return on investment and how you can get a better return on your investment. Proposal responses are one of our largest investments, and proposals are key to being able to compete well and have long-term sustained growth. If you want long-term sustained growth, you have to learn the art of competing well. You're not going to compete well if you aren't able to do great proposals. So in proposal considerations, there are people and technology costs that are associated with capture, business intelligence, recruiting, proposal writers, partner selection, contracting, solutioning, pricing, past performance, administration. All these things, we could go on, and they're representative of the things that you need in order to compete well. But your return on investment is going to be low or non-existent without a high probability of win. Always look for, how do I get a high probability of win? And the right teaming partners increase your probability of win, and normally they increase it significantly. Just imagine for 1 second that you actually have a proposal cost of $30K. Every time you put in a proposal, it costs you $30,000. You do 10 proposals, it's just you. You spend $300,000 and win nothing. And I know many of us have been in a situation where we have spent significant money without a true return on our investment. I can tell you for a fact, as I begin to tap into the principles, the things that I'm telling you today regarding teaming, it significantly increased our revenue. It's a part of the reason we've been consistently growing in 5,000, all these other things. Next slide. So here's just a quick and dirty visual scenario, a basic visual. Scenario one is where you're going it alone and you're bidding and you're looking at your costs. And again, these are all representative costs. These are not specific costs or a specific proposal. These are just representative costs. Don't think that, business intelligence should always cost $7,000 or this percentage of your proposal. No, I'm just saying these are representative. But in this scenario, you go it alone and it costs you this much to actually go after this particular proposal. Or scenario two, where if you really look and you look at your proposal objectively and you look at it strategically, what you recognize is that in your perfect world, try to form your perfect world and then find partners who can fill in that perfect world. In your perfect world, you really should have more business intelligence on that particular agency. So rather than guess or rather than have 60% of the intelligence, find a partner. You find a partner who has that intelligence that you know you need. Turns out the partner comes with a solution architect who really can help you shore up all of your solutioning. So what happens? So no longer is the entire cost on you, but also neither is all the work it takes to get that proposal together. And then it also at the same time increases your P-win. So you have a much better opportunity of winning. You could do this 100 different scenarios, but what's important is what value do I add to an opportunity and what value do I need? It is so important going into any opportunity you want to compete for that you lead with your value proposition and understand your partner's value proposition. And adding value is critical to being a really good partner. Knowing your value is critical to being a really good partner. So I want you to think about, for those of you who haven't, I want you to really think about what value do I add and what value do I need, and do everything you can to think about it strategically. I'm in information technology. One of the technologies that I pursue, go after, and do is cloud, for instance. I don't just meet someone and say, hey, I do cloud. And I may know I do cloud, but we have past performance in and are really good on what I call the front end, the assessments, the intake, putting together business case analyses, putting together all the integrated master schedules. I am always looking for great partners who can do that, because maybe we can go after PMO work, and great partners who do more on the migration side, because those individuals and I now make a complete cloud package. But think about, before you go into any environment, what is it that I have to offer? Now, let's suppose for a second that you actually do not have any past performance, right? Everybody has to start somewhere. You should look at what is the value proposition you do have. When I had zero past performance and was starting from scratch, instead what I offered was, hey, I have fantastic business development and recruiting. Here's what I have to offer. I would like to be a part of your team. If they needed that in that particular agency, I was on the team. Or maybe I traded that for a solution architect and proposal writer. So just think in terms of what way can you add value, and understand at the end of the day, it's about winning. I recently had a win where we had a fantastic partner, but they were one of a few incumbents, and a contractor, an agency was consolidating contracts. So what happens in this particular scenario is that we had a great chance, but so did a lot of other people. Well, what we went out and did was we found another contractor who wasn't on the project, but they had a great rep in the agency. We added them. And in the end, we actually won. It decreased the amount of our own revenue, but it increased our probability of win. The goal is always to win. Next slide. Partnering is important. Start looking for partners during the RFI stage. Don't wait. Again, being strategic when you know that an opportunity is coming out, begin to look for that partner. Another way partnership also maximizes your ROI is that in post-award, you can realize savings through shared costs, because you're still going to have staffing, recruiting, transitioning, deliverables, generation costs, standing up, deliverable generation costs, standing up a project. All of those are costs. All of those are things you have to do. As a matter of fact, I know of a partner who, when she wins something that's more than a few FTE, she has a small group. She puts it out to all of them to staff. Why is that? It's not just, hey, I want to give away my work to everyone. What she knows is that decreases her initial recruiting costs, but also she staffs quickly. At the end of the day, from the time you get on a project, you are building past performance. From second one on, you are building past performance and a reputation with that client. Imagine coming on board with all of your people with the first day or within a week or two. So it's strategic and it's smart, and it helps helps her with her return on her investment. Next slide. When should you team? As you're developing your strategy to actually go after projects, identify what types of partners you'll need so you can be intentional whenever you are meeting potential partners. We talked about being strategic. If you don't have certain socioeconomics, but maybe you have nominal business intelligence or solutioning in that area, look for, as you're out there, partners who have the socioeconomic that you need. Just think about it. What's the past performance you're missing? Socioeconomics, areas of expertise. And when you're looking at individuals, partner too with individuals who could become formal or informal mentors to you. Always think any opportunity you have to increase your return on investment or P-win on a project, you should look very strongly at teaming. Next slide. Here's the analogy of a good partner. Because when you're teaming, I probably, if I ask for a show of hands, who has had a bad experience with a teaming partner, I would probably get everyone on the call raising their hands. So I just want to share some lessons learned I personally have. I can tell you that vetting a partner is critical, not just for value. So you should look not just for value add, but also for like values. The more closely your partner, you and your partner are aligned with core values, in your core values, the more successful the relationship will be. And one of the quick ways I actually vet a lot of partners to figure out if we have similar core values is that I look them up on LinkedIn. And I look up the head of the company on LinkedIn, and I see who they're connected to. And I see if there are a number of people that I personally know, like, and trust that they're connected to. And I will call one or two of those individuals and say, hey, tell me about Jane Doe or John Doe. Tell me about that individual. They do. And then that gives me a comfort level that our core values are aligned. And I can tell you, this is so critical. One of my hardest lessons learned is that I had a very sizable project where I literally had everything. And when I say everything, I mean I had all of the past performance. I had all of I knew the price to win, everything about it. It was sizable. All I needed, I didn't have the socioeconomic. I needed someone. I found someone, but I vetted people mostly just for the technical acumen. 6 months onto the project, once it was awarded, less than 6 months, I was kicked off. It was a 5-year contract, very sizable, but they kicked us off. Well, I didn't have much recourse. Even in a lawsuit, I was only able to get back part of the profit for part of the first year. So that was a really valuable lesson. Since I've been very, very careful about vetting for core values, and then the results have been amazing. So these are some of the things. Share your core values, understand those, negotiate teaming and subcontract agreements fairly. If someone is looking at everything you do from a win-win perspective, this is a good partner, and they're going to negotiate fairly. They're going to be willing to put legal agreements in writing. If someone tells you that they're going to give you 49% of a project, but they're not willing to put it in writing, I would be very careful about that. And they're also committed to contributing their strengths to the win. So it's not just about what they get out of it, but it's about, I'm strong and in this area, and I want to see to it that we as a team win. Next slide. Some other things is that they participate in and engage in RFI and RFP meetings when you start early and are going after something together. Assigned responsibilities, they take seriously. Their assignments are completed on time, and they're quality assignments. They're not the individuals who are always missing meetings, always missing assignments. They look out for the team as a whole and win. They're normally individuals who you can find are liked and respected by the customer. They're liked and respected by others, again, that you trust, and you find that they're a problem solver when things go wrong. You can find all these things, and they honestly periodically can still turn out not to be a great partner, but if you have all these characteristics, the likelihood is very, very slim. Next slide. If you want growth and success, though, you have to be a good teaming partner. So keep this in mind. Be a good teaming partner. Look for one and be one. Every government decision maker and contractor is looking for good teaming partners. A lot of our growth has been, our first 5-year contract was because someone thought we were a good teaming partner. Our first multi-million-dollar contract was because someone thought we were a good teaming partner. Probably 50 to 60% of our growth right now is because someone called us to partner on something. They thought we were a good teaming partner. So be a good teaming partner and look for good teaming partners and train your staff to be good teaming partners, a good teaming partner. Next slide. Again, be strategic. We've already talked about it, but look for partners in agencies you're targeting or in agencies where you currently do work. And speaking of that, when you're looking at agencies, you're looking strategically. Focus. Try to do 4 to 5 agencies, not the entire federal government, but be strategic. Look at a few agencies at a time, but look for individuals who fill in gaps and that can strengthen your team for opportunities. Next slide. Here's how you find some good partners. Networking events, outreach events, conferences, volunteering, professional associations. Ask trusted partners for teaming partners. SBA also has SBA Subnet where you can go and find teaming partners. And I can tell you that these are some good places to go and find partners. But we're bombarded, I know I am, with agency outreaches, events, conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why you need a strategy also, because it allows you to focus. And when you see an outreach event, when you see a networking event, you know what kind of partner you need, you know which agencies, you know what you're going after, and it really, really helps you to focus, hone in on things so that you have, you're able to have return on investment in terms of your time. Next slide. These are now, you know what good characteristics you're looking for. You have to get return on your investment. You have a strategy. You have these things, and you want to add a potential prime, but you need some practical information on this potential partner. You need information. So, does this partner have prime contracts in my focus agency? What are their socioeconomics and their NAICS? What are their capabilities? I know the contract, and sometimes it's around the contract. You know, what are the I know the contract I want to go after, but who's the current prime? Next slide. This is where we get into some tools for partner forensics. One is FPDS. If you're not familiar with it, you absolutely should be. I love it because it has an easy, you see that easy search? That's exactly what it is. If you put in any prime contractor, it's going to bring up information on what their top, all the top agencies that they have prime contracts in. You can drill down on either of those agencies, and it will tell you in more granularity what those contracts are. In addition to that, it will tell you all the specifics about each and every one of those contracts. So if your partner tells you, oh yes, we're a major player at HHS, we've done $15 million in prime contracts, that is so easy to verify. You simply go to FPDS and see if that's true, because the government uses FPDS to record all prime contract wins over the micro purchase threshold. So there's an incredible amount of information in here regarding, for a given award, all the socioeconomics associated with it, who awarded it, period of performance, what it was about, any and everything almost that you want to know about a contract is here. They don't have statements of work, the things of that nature, but all the award information they absolutely have. You can also put a contract number into Easy Search, and it will give you information on that contract as well. And here, as in all of the subsequent slides, there's both the website and user guide. Next slide. USAspending.gov. It is very similar, actually, to FPDS, and the procurement information that is in USA Spending comes from FPDS. However, USA Spending also provides information on grants and loans. In addition to that, it actually gives you information in a graphical format. For instance, when I was talking about the contracts, I won $15 million in prime contracting. I did $15 million at HHS last year. Well, you go and put them in USA Spending, it actually would show you for a given partner their contract history, in prime contract history, in a graphical format, so you can see exactly how many dollars over what and how many years. Very good tool to use. Next slide. Then there's the SBA Dynamic Small Business Search. Again, this will give you a lot of the company capabilities, socioeconomic status, the NAICS, ownership status, and also many times past performance. This is used by a lot of contracting officers across the government to look for small businesses. And you go through SAM in order to update it. If you have not updated it, if you have not heard about it, you need to go update it, because this is a way a lot of government contractors actually find companies. Next slide. And then there's sam.gov, which we all hear about, we all know about. Many of us have to register in SAM, and you are able to go there and also look for opportunities. But the same information you registered in SAM about you is available for almost any other company you would like to research. So don't rule out sam.gov because it has significant information on partners as well. Next slide. So this is the end of my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Wendy to take a break. Thank you for listening. I hope I didn't bore you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. What we're going to do, everyone, is take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to answer some of your questions that you had regarding operations before I pass it over to Shane to speak about the legalities. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. Jackie, before we get started with Shane, we just had a few questions regarding operations.
Sure, absolutely.
So the first question was, can a SDVOSB utilize a teaming agreement in pursuit of an IDIQ or MACC?
Okay, what is what was the first part? Did you say?
Can a SDVOSB utilize a teaming agreement in pursuit of an IDIQ?
Absolutely. Whether, and it all depends on whether you are, of course, a prime or sub. As a minimum, a teaming agreement on IDIQs that I do at least say that I plan to be a part of your team. So sometimes they offer more than that, but it at least says that I will be a part of your team, that you want to effectively utilize me if we win, and it tells me what you expect of me as a teaming partner.
Thank you, Jackie. Another question is, as a prime, do you respond to RFPs? I've been told that primes hesitate responding to RFPs.
As a prime, I respond to RFPs all the time. But again, I respond strategically. I respond to RFPs when I have a high probability of win. I don't respond to any and every old RFP. I respond based on, do I have all the elements that I talked about to actually win? Otherwise, I don't get any return on my investment. Again, the whole thing is for you at the end of the day to actually respond and win. So yes, primes respond to RFPs all the time, but smart primes and successful primes respond based on the return on investment and their probability of win.
Thank you. Is it common for companies to seek teaming agreements after a contract has been awarded?
No, you normally do teaming agreements before. I highly recommend to you that you ask for a teaming agreement before the proposal goes in. Because as I stated earlier, a good teaming partner will tell you in writing what they plan to do with you once you win. They'll be clear about it. You can agree on it, and they will put it in writing. So that is definitely a sign of a good teaming partner if it's someone who's willing to put the agreement that you made in writing.
Can you please tell us a little bit more about reiterate when you said you were kicked off of a project? Some participants said that they missed that.
Okay. Well, I mean, the story really was that, as I said, at the time, I didn't have the socioeconomic that was needed to win this particular project, but I actually had all the business intelligence. I could put together the proposal. I knew what the pricing strategy was to win. I knew everything. The customer really loved me. I knew everything we needed to win a sizable proposal. I simply did not have the socioeconomics. So again, I vetted for the socioeconomics and some technical acumen, but I did not vet to see if this was a person that had similar core values. And so this person and I did not have similar core values. I have very much so. I'm a generous partner and a win-win partner. This person operated more so out of greed. So once we had won it and they were the prime, I couldn't be the prime. Within 6 months or less, they literally said, okay, goodbye. We no longer want you on the team. It was a 5-year contract, so they took over the entire contract. And, that whole story was about that partners, not just for technical acumen or value add, but vet partners for core values. You want partners that share your values. That was a very hard lesson learned for me. Since then, again, I vet partners and I vet them, I think, pretty well. It's not going to always be perfect, but after I vet them, I can tell you I have fantastic teaming relationships, partnering relationships now.
Thank you. What is your recommendation for use of an NDA in preparation of a teaming agreement, or just discuss disclosure in the teaming agreement?
No, get an NDA. When I was speaking earlier, even about things like value add, right? Say someone comes to you, you have a great relationship with an agency and decision makers in a particular agency, then and someone says, hey, well, let's look at partnering on ABC opportunity. Do not disclose what those great relationships are until you sign an NDA, because an NDA always helps to, it's not a perfect solution, but it helps to protect you legally. And again, individuals who are willing to speak with you pretty openly have no problem with signing an NDA, because you both are now protected against disclosures to other potential partners. So I would say I do. I always get an NDA before I'm open with specific information.
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. We don't have any more questions regarding operations.
Okay.
Now I am going to turn it over to you, Shane, to speak about the legal considerations.
Hello, Wendy. Thank you so much. And thanks to Jackie for being my co-presenter. Did a really great job giving you some of the operational guidelines. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I'm going to go through some of the legal considerations that are important to keep in mind in a teaming relationship. A little bit of that is with the Federal Acquisition Regulation. A little bit of that is with the Small Business Administration regulations. When you're working with two small businesses or a small business and a large business, there's certain rules that apply, certain things you have to keep track of. And that should also be mentioned and accounted for in your teaming agreements and subcontracts. And then some of the things are just some common drafting and best practices that we recommend for anyone that's working on an agreement. And as Jackie mentioned, one of those things you want to see in a teaming partner is that they're willing to do a written agreement with you just to kind of get on the same page. I almost view that teaming agreement almost as a litmus test for the cooperation and the negotiating abilities of both parties. If you can come to an agreement without too much hassle on a teaming agreement, that kind of bodes well for working together on a project, doing a subcontract, and the performance side. Of course, it's not going to solve everything. It's just an agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean the other person's going to have their personnel are all perfect or that performance is going to go perfect. But on the flip side, if you can't come to an agreement with someone easily, or there's a lot of sticking points on a teaming agreement, that's can sometimes be a red flag for moving forward with that teaming partner. So we can move forward to the next slide. So as far as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, there is a specific provision that talks about the allowability of contractor teaming arrangements, and that's going to be mentioned in solicitations. It's up there on the screen. It very briefly explains and references a joint venture type arrangement, which, as noted, we'll talk about in a future presentation with the VA. And then it talks about the prime subcontractor arrangement, which is the focus of the webinar that we're talking about today. And with each of these, the government recognizes that you can use these type of contractor teaming arrangements and basically encourages them, but doesn't have too much detail on what you really need to include or how you have to structure it. So we'll talk about some of those things and we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so what is kind of the underlying feature of a prime sub relationship? For some of you, this may be old hat. For others, it's just things you need to keep in mind because you're kind of just getting your feet wet in this field. So only one party, the prime contractor, is at the prime contract level and is responsible to the government for performance. So the government, unless, now we're not talking about joint ventures, that's a different topic, but in a prime sub relationship, you've got one company, one federal contractor that is the face that interacts and mainly negotiates with the government. Of course, those subs on a personnel level are going to be working with various counterparts with the federal government, but the prime has to take the main position if there's sort of a question or confusion or concern with the government. It's the prime that's going to be the one that's going to be interacting with the government, of course, in consultation with the subcontractors on the team, but it's got to go through the prime. Is the one that has the responsibility there. So if there's a problem, it's going to go to the prime that has to head off those problems. Subcontractor payment is going to normally be on a predetermined basis. That's something you kind of mention or you lay down the groundwork of that in your teaming agreement, and then you really flesh it out in your subcontract agreement is how most people do it. You know, it's often that may be firm fixed price or it could be cost reimbursable, but you want to have that explained and arranged for in your teaming agreement and in your subcontract. So in contrast, I mentioned joint ventures mainly as a distinction. A joint venture, you're normally going to create a separate legal entity such as a LLC, a limited liability company that becomes the contracting party. With a prime sub relationship, you have your original company, and if your company is going to be the prime, then that's the company that's going to submit the proposal, submit the quotation. If you're a subcontractor, of course, it's the other company that's going to be using their existing entity that's going to submit that proposal, and your company will be listed as a team member, often in the proposal that may be mentioned in the proposal or quotation, but you don't create a separate legal entity. And then I'll mention subcontracting limits because that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'll kind of go through some of the basics of those so everyone's kind of on an even playing field there. When it comes to limitation on subcontracting, which is the idea that for small business set-asides, a small business prime should not subcontract too much, not more than is allowed under the SBA rules. These subcontracting limitations apply to the prime contractor only. So it's the small business prime contractor that has to worry about those. And I will talk a little bit about the similarly situated entity, and that's the basic idea is you have a small business prime and you have a small business subcontractor that's the same socioeconomic designation. I'll talk about how that works in a subsequent slide. So let's move on to next slide. Okay, subcontracts. I mean, it's at the base level, what is a subcontract under the federal acquisition regulation? There's not a kind of easy to find definition, but one of the definitions that's included in the FAR that is instructive is what's up here on the screen. It's a contract entered into between the prime, or it could be a lower tier sub entering into a subcontract, and it's for the purpose of providing those supplies or equipment or services under a prime contract. So you could have all sorts of agreements. You know, as a company, you got a lease, that's an agreement. You've got vendor agreements. Maybe you got consultants out there. Maybe you have a services agreement with your attorney. It's only a subcontract if it is for providing services specific to that prime contract. However, it doesn't have to have the word subcontract at the top of the agreement. It could be called something else. What matters is more the substance. So you could have an independent contractor, 1099, that is doing work under a specific prime contract, and then that could become a subcontract. Even if you don't really have a written agreement with that person, maybe it's a handshake agreement, that still may count as a subcontract because this definition, looks at the substance of what the other company or other, could be an individual is providing, not just the label that's put on that agreement. So pretty broad definition under the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And sometimes people could get confused by that. In fact, the Small Business Administration rules on limitation on subcontracting specifically mention an independent contractor can count as a subcontractor. So make sure you're not kind of confusing things and keeping things in the right category when you're trying to figure out, okay, what's a subcontractor? What is an independent contractor? And I'll talk about that a little bit on another slide. You can go to the next slide. Okay, I mentioned this before, but it is very important for, if you're getting into this, getting into the contracting field and you haven't done a lot of them, always remember that the prime contractor is 100% responsible for performance. If there are concerns with performance, if there's concerns with delivery times, if there is an issue where the government maybe is perceived to be causing delays or something like that, the prime contractor is the one that's going to have to either be responsible for fixing things and making sure things are deadlines are being met, quality control is being met. Even though it's the subcontractor that's going to be carrying that out, the prime has to make sure they're putting the pressure on the subs to keep all those things in line. And so, for instance, if a subcontractor cannot perform, in the horrible situations such as bankruptcy, that may not be an excuse for not completing the project. Normally, the prime will have to, either self-perform or as quickly as possible come up with a new subcontractor, and of course, be in communication with the government about those issues, so that you never want these things to, if at all possible, you don't want the government to be coming to the contractor with the concerns. You want to address them proactively. And in some cases, certain laws such as Service Contract Act, if there's a concern or violation by a subcontractor, the prime could be held responsible for those. So there's, of course, a lot of responsibility on the prime level. Some cases, you, as a contractor, you may want to approach a contract using as the subcontractor. And Jackie kind of mentioned some of those instances when she was starting out. Working as the subcontractor can be the right approach, because then you're not responsible for the entire contract. You're only responsible for those aspects of it that you've agreed to be responsible for, and the rest of it is not your responsibility. Okay, next slide. Okay, limitation on subcontracting. The main idea here, the main principle, is that for small business set aside contracts, the government is balancing two things. It's saying, okay, if a contract is reserved for small businesses or a socioeconomic designation, such as the four socioeconomic designations: service disabled, veteran-owned small business, women-owned small business, hub zone, or 8A program, then the government policy is that prime contractor does a significant amount of performance. That can vary based on whether it's a services contract versus a construction contract. But on the other hand, the government policy recognizes that a small business prime contractor may need the help of other contractors. So they balance that by putting a percentage in that says, small business prime, you can only subcontract a certain amount to non-similar companies, and enforces those rules through SBA regulations. And it's ultimately, though, keep in mind, it's actually the contracting agency that is tasked with the responsibility to enforce these and to determine compliance. Often that may be in consultation with an SBA representative, but it's actually the contracting agency that has the responsibility, even though the Small Business Administration it comes up with the regulations. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so there's those competing policy goals. Small business doesn't serve as a pass-through and allows some subcontracting even to large businesses, but Congress and the SBA have set those percentages to allow small businesses to do that work, but still get enough experience. And the idea here also is, the idea behind all the small business rules, or one of the main ideas behind it, is to enhance the industrial base of the United States. You can get a lot of innovations, a lot of new ideas from small businesses, maybe that come up with things that a large business wouldn't think of. So we want to enhance those and keep new small businesses coming in and working for the government. And having set-asides is one way to do that. But a small business is not going to really get an opportunity to grow and get bigger and do bigger projects unless they're doing some of that work themselves. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the limitation on subcontracting apply to certain types of contracts. If it is a socioeconomic designation, those ones I've already mentioned that are up there on the slide, such as 8A, it's going to apply to any set-aside contract, no matter how small it is. So you could have a very small contract under that $250,000 simplified acquisition threshold. You still have to meet the limitation on subcontracting if it's a socioeconomic set-aside. For small business set-asides not under one of SBA's socioeconomic categories, the limitation on subcontracting only applies if it's above the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $250,000. So you could have a small value contract that's set aside for small business, and actually you don't have to comply with the limitation on subcontracting because that's how the regulations are set up. Note that there is, you got the micro purchase threshold of $10,000. A lot of these rules don't apply way at that level, so that's a little bit of an exception to some of these things. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for kind of planning these things out, I always like to say you need to plan out compliance with limitation on subcontracting from an early stage. And maybe that's even when you're looking at your teaming agreement and you're kind of having those talks with your teaming partners. You mentioned some stuff about limitation on subcontracting, especially if you say you got a small business prime and you got a large business subcontractor. I think you definitely should have those conversations. That maybe it doesn't have to take up all of your time. Obviously, it's one among many things you're competing things you got to worry about. But you want to say, okay, how are we going to meet this limitation on subcontracting? What roles is each company going to have so we can ensure compliance with that? Because you have to meet these rules at certain time periods during performance. Compliance is determined at the base term and then each option period. So if you have a 1-year base contract and 4 option years, like how many contracts are set up, you have to meet the limitation on subcontracting in that base year, and then the calculation starts over. You meet it in the first option year, second option year, etc. If you have for instance, a construction project and it's got basically just 1 period of performance, then you have to meet it in that base period. You're not going to have option periods for certain types of construction or other contracts potentially, although I see it most often in the construction world. So in other words, occasionally see a company come in and say, okay, small business, you're just kind of figuring things out. We're the large business. We'll take the first couple of years and do most of the work, and then you'll balance it out, average it out in the later option years. You can't do it that way because the rule says you have to comply within each period of performance within the base year and then each option period. Now for orders, it's a little bit more complicated because there's some discretion there. The contracting officer may require that you comply with the limitation on subcontracting for each order, or it could allow compliance overall for the IDIQ. I would say, I think most common is that you comply within each order and then within each time period or period of performance within the order. So if you're not sure about that, it's something you either want to read through the solicitation to see if that's mentioned there, put in a Q&A, or if you get the award and it's still unclear, reach out to your contracting officer and figure out how they're going to check compliance for that. Note that this is one of those rules where basically what the rule says is at any time, the contracting officer can reach out and say, okay, show me how you're meeting the limitation on subcontracting, show me how you're compliant. So you want to have a little folder or some thing set aside to show you kind of on an ongoing basis how you're meeting that. That way you can not be caught unawares if it is requested by the contracting officer, because it's at the contracting officer's discretion when they ask for it. Are they going to ask for it each year? Are they going to ask for it at the end of the contract? And there are some contracts where the contracting officer does not ask for a specific list of documents or percentages, but you still have to meet those requirements because they are listed as part of the contract, and so it is a term of the contract to comply with limitation on subcontracting. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just real basic on this. You start with the amount paid by the government to determine compliance with the limitation on subcontracting. So that's your dollar amount you start with. There's a separate rule I won't get into for non-manufacturers, and that's basically if you're providing supplies to the government, a common one may be medical supplies to the VA. If it's a supply contract, it's a separate rule that you need to comply with that we're not going to really get into today because there's just not time. But note that if you're doing supplies, it's a separate rule for you, and you'd have to make sure you're meeting those requirements instead of this limitation on subcontracting. Okay, next slide. So you've got that amount paid by the government, and I'll have a little example here in one of these slides to drive it home for you. You got the amount paid by the government, then you exclude certain costs. It depends on the category of contract, what costs you're going to exclude, and those categories are services contracts, general construction, specialty trade construction, and supply contracts. So there's only those 4 categories. It has to fit in one, depends on the NAICS code. Note that supply contract is actually if you're manufacturing the good for the government, so not too common, and you'll kind of know if you're in that area. If you are supplying a good made by another company, you need to meet the non-manufacturer rule, a different SBA rule. Most common ones that we deal with is going to be services. That covers anything like IT, like Jackie's company does, or construction. And then, within that, general construction is kind of a GC rule. Specialty trade would be something like roofing construction, which has a different rule attached to it. Most service contracts do not allow for exclusions. Construction does allow for exclusions. So go to the next slide. And again, I'm just sort of breezing through this to give you the basic rules. The most common thing that you exclude when you're determining compliance with limitation on subcontracting would be in the construction world, both general and specialty trade. You're going to exclude the cost of materials. So something like gravel that you're hauling to a site or concrete would be very clearly in that materials side. And when you're doing this calculation to see if you meet it, before you apply the percentages, you subtract out the cost of materials. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so here's these percentages. So you got the amount paid by the government. You exclude cost of materials in the construction world. You generally don't exclude things in other categories. And then here, percentages in the services world, small business, you got to do 50% of the contract dollars. Subcontractors can do the other 50% or less. And then general construction, prime contractor has to do 15%, can subcontract up to 85%. Government recognizes that general construction, that if you're a GC, you're going to use a lot of subcontractors, and specialty trade, I gave the example of roofing, a little bit less. Self-performance has to be 25%. Subcontractors can do no more than 75%. So that's what you have to, as I said, got to keep these numbers in mind at the beginning of a contract to make sure you're doling out things the correct way and splitting things up the correct way with your non-small business team members. Okay, next slide here. All right, we've got an example here. The Air Force has given a company a $1 million women-owned small business set-aside contract. It's under the engineering services NAICS code listed there, so we're in the services world. And then we can exclude $100,000 of company-wise costs. So this would be the most common example I see in the services world of an excludable cost, or the one that jumps to mind, is airline commercial airline flights. If that is not the primary purpose of a services contract, but you're going to be using a lot of travel costs for airline flights, which is not something that a small business provides within the United States, so we'll say you could exclude that $100,000 from the calculation. So it's a services contract. That means small business, you got to do 50% of the cost. You subtract the 100,000 off the top, leaving you with $900,000 as the amount you apply that percentage to. Apply that 50% to the 900,000, meaning a minimum performance of $450,000. Meaning the small business prime contractor, in this case a woman-owned small business, has to get minimum $450,000 of that contract. The other remaining $450,000 could go to subcontractors that are not women-owned small businesses. And then again, if the agency asks for that information, you need to be able to show, okay, here's the baseline numbers to show that, and then the agency could then ask for subcontractor invoices or further documentation, something like that. So you need to be able to establish those. Next slide. Okay, similarly situated entity is kind of a long-winded way of describing a company with the same socioeconomic set aside as the prime contract. So if it's an 8A set aside, an 8A company, it also has to be small for that NAICS code that is assigned to the subcontract. Normally, or in a lot of cases, the prime contract and the subcontract are going to have the same size standard attached to them, the same NAICS code. It does not have to be that way. You could have a prime contract doing one sort of work and the subcontract is doing a small part of that, which actually is under a different NAICS code in some situations. So a similarly situated entity is basically, 8A set aside, you got an 8A subcontractor that you're using as part of your team. And that makes it easier to comply with the limitation on subcontracting. If you go to the next slide, here's an example of that. Basically, if you're subcontracting to a similarly situated entity, so that could be, it's an SDVOSB set aside, you got an SDVOSB subcontractor that you're working with, it counts as if the prime is actually performing it for purposes of meeting the limitation on subcontracting. So it's treated as if it were self-performance. So here's the example. We got company Y again. They have that same $450,000 amount that they need to receive for performance requirements under the WSB set-aside contract. And then company Y is going to self-perform $300,000, subcontract $200,000 to a similarly situated entity, meaning another WOSB business. And then the other amount is going to a large business. So this is a compliant arrangement. You aggregate or combine the similarly situated entity, the two WSB companies basically, it's going to be $500,000. This is over the 50% threshold of $450,000. So that would meet the limitation on subcontracting. Okay, next slide. All right, and we'll take a little break now. I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Thank you, Shane. Everyone, we're going to take about a 3-minute break, and then when we come back, we will address the questions regarding the information that Shane has covered so far. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So Shane, we just have a few questions that came in. Uh, some of these were during when Jackie had spoke, but then also when you had spoke. Let's
Okay.
go down. So one question was, are you able to recommend where we can locate sample and subcontract agreement?
Oh, that is a good question. There's not, I mean, I can't really point you to one specific resource. I know sometimes people get them from, I would say a lot of times you get it from your teaming partner. You know, if you're working with a prime, they'll send you a subcontract agreement for you to review or a teaming agreement. So that can be a good resource. You know, we commonly draft those for people, but unfortunately, there's not a thing where SBA puts out sample agreements that I've seen. SBA used to put out sample agreements for joint venture agreements, but I think they've kind of stopped doing that, and I haven't seen that um, for subcontracts or teaming agreements. Unfortunately, those resources may be out there, but most commonly I see it coming from your partner or kind of a trusted other company that you work with. That's pretty common as well. That may be a better resource than just grabbing something off the internet.
Do you mind if I speak to
Oh,
that, Wendy?
please.
Yes, Jackie. Yes.
Okay. Yes, just wanted to say, Shane, I love what you said. A trusted teaming partner is someone who could give you a template. I think what is really important, though, is that it should be tailored to your company. I know for our company, our initial teaming agreements and subcontract agreements, we invested in having our attorney draw up templates because a lot of times they already have an idea, they've done them before, and then they'll ask you questions that are specific to your company and your needs, and they can draw one up that will help you protect you the way you need to be protected. So even if you get it from a partner, you need to be very careful. Maybe that's the start, and maybe you can use that even to give to your attorney. But for us, all of our initial legal agreements, we had an attorney draw them up for us.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Shane. Another question is, can a prime contractor use a large, I'm sorry, can a small business use a large business as a subcontractor? That's what their question was. As long as that small business is 51%, like if the contract is set aside for a small business and they 51% own the business.
Yes, for sure. A small business can use a large business sub, and I'll mention some kind of tips and things to keep in mind, but you want to make sure your teaming agreement is reflective of the small business prime being in charge of the contract. And so where it could come up is if there is a size protest or that's the most common way. That means SBA is going to be examining the relationship between the prime and the sub. And a lot of times they'll look to the proposal and the teaming agreement. And it's another reason for having a teaming agreement to show that the prime contractor is in charge. And I'll mention a couple things, but you wouldn't want to have it be too cited towards the large business subcontractor. That would be indicative that the subcontractor has too much control in the relationship, and that can be shown in your teaming agreement. But yes, you can do that as long as you're kind of careful as the small business prime to stay in charge of the subcontract.
Thank you. Is it a good idea to get a teaming agreement for a BPA or contract vehicle? I was told it's not a common practice.
I don't know if it's how common it is. I usually recommend having a teaming agreement for any kind of substantial contract that you're going to be doing with another company where you're going to be sort of submitting as a team on the proposal. So I don't know why BPAs would be different. There may be some reason for that in that particular industry, but I would say if it's something, I mean, you can sort of have a In some cases, I work with clients that have a simpler teaming agreement, depending on the type of work that it is, or some cases more complicated, depending on the dollar amount or the complicated nature of the kind of how many team members you're going to have or something like that. So you can vary it, but you want to have something, I think, in writing to reflect the understanding between the two parties.
Wendy, if you don't mind again, I just wanted to say that again. Usually when a partner is serious about you being a part of the team, they will give you a teaming agreement. Now, if there's a vehicle already in place, sometimes when people say that, what really happens with some vehicles is that you add partners as they are needed. But even if you add at that point, you're still going to need a teaming agreement. So most partners, if they're serious about partnering with you, even if it's a vehicle, they give you a teaming agreement. We have vehicles, and I can tell you that we give partners subcontract agreements for that vehicle that we really plan to team with. We definitely do teaming agreements if we're serious about teaming. If we're just having a conversation and I'm saying, hey, if you ever want to use our vehicle, give me a call. You probably don't need it, but usually if they're serious about doing business, it's been pretty rare for me that they don't provide a teaming agreement.
Thank you, Jackie and Shane. Another question is, how do you know when you are priced to win?
Wow, that's okay. That's a complex question because you have to do a lot of forensics to know your price to win. I mean, I would highly recommend, if the contract is already in existence, that you go to FPDS and find out what is the current price. You can do that in FPDS. Whatever, find the contract number, or if you know who the prime was, what agency it was, and who they're doing the work with, you can go to FPDS and actually find the price. That helps you a lot. That is my go-to. If it's on a vehicle, which a lot of times, but sometimes specific awards and specific contract vehicles may or may not be on there. So in that case, I really do things like, honestly, Google. If you know the contract number, it's pretty rare. You can put a contract number in Google and it won't tell you how much it's awarded for. So I start from there and I go backwards and see, okay, did anything change since that contract was awarded? Did they add anything to it? Did they take away from it? What changed in the meantime, and how is that going to affect my pricing? And if I know nothing changed and it's the same contract, I can tell you honestly, most people then try to bid, at least like 5% or 10% less. Now, you have to be really, really careful about that. I personally always bid best value, and that means to ensure that you can actually not just compete, but once you win it, you can execute. Never mix up, the price to win and the price to execute. They have to be one and the same. If you can't execute, honestly, there's no point in winning the contract, because what happens, you get a very, very, very bad rep. So just make sure you can execute. Go to FPDS, and it will normally tell you how much that contract is today. Do your solutioning, whether you can do it or you need a partner to help you do it. Do your solutioning. Be sure your solution is covered within that particular price point.
Thank you. This was regarding your presentation, Shane. Is specialty trade construction versus GC defined at the NAICS code level? For services contract, first example, AF contract was $1 million. Can you also exclude the cost of materials and apply the LOS percentage to only the service labor lines?
Uh, Good question. I think it's kind of two-parter. Yeah, the general construction versus specialty trade is shown based on the NAICS code, and you can kind of find one place I tell people to look is the SBA table of size standards. They're kind of listed out. It'll in a nice fashion if you're not sure. There's also the NAICS manual, but generally the ones that are around 40 million size standard or general construction. That's things like road construction or GC work, and then specialty trade are the slightly lower size standards for things like roofing, or maybe there's one for drywall, electrical, that sort of thing. So it is based on the NAICS code. Look at the SBA table of size standards to have an easy resource for that, and you can just find that on SBA's website. And then the other question is about excluding costs and services. As I said, that's much trickier because the rule says it has to the the cost has to be not the primary purpose or not the main purpose of the contract. And generally, a lot of the stuff you're going to be doing is, or, could be defined as the principal purpose of the services contract. So I would go in thinking I'm probably going to have to account for all the costs and not be able to exclude things. The regulation gives examples. I mentioned one, the kind of airline travel is one. I think some other media type purchases and things like that are in there. It could be one where you want to reach out if you're really on the cusp. You might want to reach out to your contracting officer or somebody from SBA to make sure they're on the same page as you. But I wouldn't just go in there thinking you can just exclude other direct costs, because if they're related to the principal purpose of the contract, you can't exclude them in the services under the services limitation on subcontracting rule.
All right, thank you, Shane. Now I will turn it back over to you to continue the presentation.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so we're going to talk about teaming agreements. I'll go through, why you would want a teaming agreement and some of the key things to include in there, especially keeping in mind some of these small business rules that I mentioned. So limitation on subcontracting is not just kind of out there, kind of a conceptual thing. You want to mention it and address it a little bit in your teaming agreement. And we can go to the next slide. So teaming agreement basically is going to divide up and sort of get the commitment for going after a proposal together with other people on your team. One of the main reasons that people use teaming agreement is to lock in and solidify that commitment from prospective teammates. So you have all the members of your team sign an agreement. It definitely shows kind of in black and white that they are going to work, that from the prime perspective, they got all those prospective subcontractors that are going to work on the team and going to be, often they're going to be listed in the proposal. So the prime doesn't want to work with all these different subcontractors, spend the time getting to know them all, and then have the subcontractor decline to participate in the project. And again, are you necessarily going to, sue all these parties if they don't live up to them? That's, a whole different question. But if you have it written in paper, A, it shows their commitment. If they're not willing to even sign a piece of paper saying they're going to do it, then that's not a lot of commitment. And B, it lets you kind of drill down on some of the details, make sure everybody's on the same page. So it, like I said earlier, it's a little bit of a litmus test. Do you want to work with this person? Are they willing to kind of sign on the dotted line that they're going to be part of the team? From the subcontractor perspective, they want a little protection that they are likely to, or at least going to be strongly considered for that subcontract when they work on the proposal and provide information for the proposal. For instance, the teaming agreement can say the sub's going to actually draft those parts of the proposal that are relevant to the subcontractor's scope of work. The prime's going to have ultimate kind of decision on submitting the proposal, but the subcontractor has to submit those parts of the proposal, has to do that part of the work. And as a subcontractor, you want to have that commitment from the prime that they are going to in kind of from the subcontractor's perspective, you want to strongly word it as possible that as the sub, you're going to get a subcontract. You're going to be getting some performance. And sometimes on the prime's perspective, there's a little bit of a goal of not maybe being quite so specific and keeping the options open. And that's where there's a little bit of negotiating back and forth. So if you're a sub and the prime sends you the teaming agreement, you want to make sure you're looking at that scope of work and that commitment to getting a subcontract, and maybe alter that language a little bit. From the prime's perspective, they may want to keep the options open, but they still want to lock in the subcontractor. So both sides want that commitment from the other side. And that's the purpose of the teaming agreement, to actually put that in black and white. Okay, next slide. So exclusivity is one of the main things you want to address in the teaming agreement. In a lot of cases, the prime and the sub both want the team to be exclusive, meaning the prime's not going to use other subcontractors for the same scope of work. They may use the different subcontractors for other parts of the work. So you could have a team of subcontractors, but as a subcontractor, you'd probably want it, in some cases, you want it to be exclusive. That prime's going to use you, is not going to do a bunch of different proposals. Some contracts may, some solicitations may allow for submitting multiple teams, and in which case you want to have a little different rule on exclusivity. Maybe it's limited to a certain number of teams or something like that. You can be creative based on the solicitation rules. In other, maybe that's more for like an IDIQ contract, multiple award. There may be some different wrinkles there with exclusivity. For sort of a typical teaming agreement, you might want it to be exclusive, meaning prime's not going to work with another sub, sub is not going to team with another prime, and you want that to be kind of plainly written into the teaming agreement, have both parties agree that's what they're going after. Now, it's not going to, you could compete on some other solicitation, you could compete on the next solicitation. You don't want it to be overbroad in the exclusivity, limited to usually that one specific solicitation that the two parties are going after together. You want to try and avoid some post-award disputes by setting out, for instance, you might have a time frame like we're gonna do a subcontract within 30 or 60 days. So you sort of set up that expectation, something that both parties agree to, and then you put that pressure on there. If you get the award, you're going to do that subcontract pretty quickly, and both parties are on board with that, so it doesn't linger out there. I occasionally see situations where people start performance without doing the subcontract, and then they're kind of under the gun, so to speak, to get that done as quickly as possible. So you can try and avoid those things. You can also set up some of the terms of the subcontract in your teaming agreement. If maybe you're a subcontract, or maybe you're a prime and you want your invoices from the subcontractor to be set up a certain way, you go ahead and put that in your teaming agreement, then it's all kind of said and done. If a partner agrees to something in a teaming agreement, they're usually going to stick with that in the subcontract. If they don't, they better have a darn good reason for changing it up and explain that to the other partner if they had already agreed on it once. Otherwise, you're going to sort of carry forward those things like invoicing requirements into the subcontract. So you can kind of lay those things, you can kind of avoid having to negotiate them later. And then you want to demonstrate that you've met some of these key issues. I mentioned limitation on subcontracting, so that can be shown. You could literally say in your teaming agreement, if you're a small business prime, this work share has to be compliant with the limitation on subcontracting, and as a prime, I have the right to reallocate work share to ensure compliance with limitation on subcontracting. You put that in your teaming agreement, and you're giving the expectation to the subcontractor, hey, this is something that is serious, we're going to comply with it. It's in the teaming agreement. The subcontractor has agreed to it in the teaming agreement. I mentioned sort of in response to one of the questions about, okay, you've got a subcontractor, it's a large business. I don't want to get into all the details of the accessible subcontractor rule because that would take a long time, but the basic idea is, as a small business prime, if you have a large business subcontractor, you can't let that large business subcontractor be too in control of the subcontract relationship or be performing too much of the primary work that is needed under that contract. So you want to show with the way that you distinguish and that you kind of elaborate on work share, that the subcontractor is not doing, all of the main work associated with the contract, that the prime contractor is going to be doing some of that, or that you're limiting the scope of work of the subcontractor, at least in general terms. Maybe at the teaming agreement, you don't know all the details, but you're kind of putting it out there in general terms. Hey, sub, you're only doing parts of this subcontractor. You're not doing the primary and key parts of it. So those things can all be addressed in a teaming agreement, along with sort of you kind of want to have some of those nitty gritty details like, okay, yeah, each partner is responsible for their part of the proposal. Each partner is going to share, is probably going to be responsible for their own costs. You're not going to share costs. That's how most people do it. If one company hires a proposal writer, they hire they pay that proposal writer. The other company hires their own proposal writer, and keep it separate that way, and put that in the agreement so both parties know that's how it's going to be set up. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, and I think Jackie mentioned this too, you want to be as specific as possible. That's sort of the theme of some of the teaming agreement. Have a specific project mentioned at the beginning of the teaming arrangement. You can use similar teaming agreement. If you have a company that you work with and you work really well, you can use a similar teaming agreement once you've kind of got your baseline one. As Jackie mentioned, your first one, you may have reach out to an attorney to help you draft it, and then you can adapt it for future ones. If it's the same company you're working with, the same type of project, it might be very similar, but you want to make it specific to that solicitation. Sometimes we have things called master teaming agreements where parties sort of set aside some of the basic terms, but then they put in specifics for each specific solicitation. You can do it that way if you're going to, again, if you're going to have kind of working with the same company on a lot of different solicitations or something like that. Use the specific solicitation, an agency name, and you may even reference some of the scope of work or the task areas listed in the solicitation. That's pretty common to put in a teaming agreement. Okay, one company is going to work on certain task areas, maybe not do the entire work, but have a portion of that work of certain task areas, and mention that in your teaming agreement scope of work. Okay, next slide. I mean, it should kind of goes without saying, but you have to identify which company is a prime contractor. That should be kind of step one of your teaming agreement. If it's a small business set aside and you're working with a large business, or it's an SDVOSB set aside, you're working with a small business that's not an SDVOSB. You got to identify that SDVOSB as the prime contractor, and it shouldn't flip roles. You shouldn't say that in the agreement that you'll just flip sides on different solicitations or something like that. You want to sort of talk about a little bit about the experience of each company. It doesn't have to be at great length. And I think we often do this in the recitals or the intro parts of the teaming agreement. You say, okay, we're sort of setting out there, this small business is SDVOSB, this other company is not an SDVOSB, and then it's very clear what those roles are for each company. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned some of these post-award disputes that you can address these in your teaming agreement. It's better at least to be upfront and clear about them. Is the subcontractor guaranteed a subcontract? Often the subcontractor wants that to be as strong as possible, worded as strong as possible, but then the prime may want it to be a little bit more flexible. So that's something you can negotiate, and you just got to come to an agreement on it. How strong is that wording going to be? Is it going to say, we'll definitely supply a subcontractor, definitely supply a subcontract, or is it going to say the parties are going to negotiate it? And I've seen, you can do it both ways. It leaves more kind of wiggle room if you just say you're going to negotiate it. Scope of work. That is an area where you really want to double check the scope of work that's listed in the teaming agreement as a subcontractor, and you want to be, maybe you put in estimates based on percentages, based on, dollar amounts or ranges or certain labor categories or certain task areas. There's different ways to approach it. You want to be somewhat specific about that so that at least there's something in there. Occasionally, two parties want to leave that for later negotiation, And while that's not ideal, that can work as long as, you know, both people are on board with it and they know, okay, I may not get much here. I need to negotiate it later. But you want to sort of be purposeful about it. If there's a reason for not putting in a detailed scope of work for the subcontractor, you know, talk about that and have it kind of be recognized in your teaming agreement. Payment terms, or at least how they're going to be paid, firm fixed price versus cost reimbursable. And then is the, you know, maybe you put in your teaming agreement, okay, the subcontract's going to last as long as the prime has it. And the subcontractor bargains for that so that it can't be, if there's an option exercise for the prime contractor, the subcontractor also gets an option on theirs. It may just match up like that. Or the prime may say, hey, no, I want to be able to not exercise an option and move to a different subcontractor. And again, that's something you got to negotiate between prime and sub. Okay, next slide. Is a teaming agreement enforceable? The lawyer answer here is, unfortunately, it depends. In this case, from a leading case from Virginia, a court, someone tried to enforce one of these, and the court said, you know, it's not enforceable because it said there's going to be negotiation. It said that you might not get a subcontract. It said the work share could change. So those are things that could make it not enforceable. So again, you don't always view these as I'm going to sue on this. Maybe you view it as we're going to come to a meeting of the minds. We're going to hash these things out, and I trust the other party, but I want to have those things be very explicit and mentioned in writing rather than thinking I'm guaranteed everything and I can easily sue. I wouldn't go into it thinking that. Most people don't really want to jump into a lawsuit anyway, but it may not be enforceable in some states. It could depend on the state law. Okay, next slide. All right, we'll hand it over to Wendy for a break here.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to take a 2-minute break, and then we will cover the next phase of the information. So again, it'll be 2 minutes, and then afterwards, we'll address some of the pending questions. If we weren't able to address some of the pending questions by the time this training concludes, we will address it afterwards. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Shane, I'm going to turn it back over to you to continue the presentation.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And we'll kind of end up with a few key pointers on subcontracts and kind of not delving into everything, but we'll kind of give you a little overview, some big picture items to keep track of, so you can kind of know what to look out for in subcontracts. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so big picture, how does the subcontract compare to the teaming agreement? We talked kind of in depth a little bit about teaming agreements. It's going after, chasing the contract, determining, who's going to do what for a proposal. So it's all about the proposal, although you can mention some things that would be kind of go right into your subcontract. And then your subcontract is where you actually, the prime says, yep, I'm going to use this subcontractor for a specific portion of the work. The subcontractor agrees. And so you don't really have that binding component. You don't really have a liability on the part of the subcontractor until you have a subcontract in place. So of course it's going to be more detailed and more contract specific, more performance specific than the teaming agreement. Some other things it has to have are the FAR provisions, the FAR flow downs, as they're often called, where it's specific parts of the federal acquisition regulation, and in other cases, kind of specific provisions of the prime contract are going to be flowed down, meaning they are made applicable to the subcontractor, and then the subcontractor has to agree to abide by them in a kind of parallel way as the prime contractor is agreeing to abide by these various regulations. And then you've got some small business requirements that can also be addressed in the subcontract. I mentioned, ostensible subcontractor, making sure that the prime is in charge of the contract, and then limitation on subcontracting. You want to mention those and sort of account for those in your subcontract as well. So next slide. Okay, so flow downs is one of those areas where you want to address them in your subcontract. There are many federal acquisition regulation provisions and clauses that specifically say in the FAR that it has to be made applicable to the subcontractor. And so as a prime, you have to include this in the subcontract. So if you're on the subcontracting side, you're thinking, why does this federal subcontract have, a very long laundry list of FAR clauses? Because the federal government requires it, and so the prime has to incorporate those into the subcontract. If it's not in there, then it's technically breaching a term of the contract, because the prime contract says I have to include this in my subcontract, and that's why it's in there. And some of them, may seem more or less relevant to a particular contract, but they have to be in there and addressed. And I've seen people do it different ways. Actually, go to the next slide. I'll mention some of those in there. So common mistakes would be if you just have a handshake agreement or a spoken agreement, you can't really flow down FAR clauses. It's going to be kind of hard to say. And also I include FAR clause X, I include FAR clause Y. Obviously that's kind of hard to do out loud. Those have to be in a written agreement. And you don't want to just use a commercial subcontractor or a subcontract that you find on a website or other internet resource, because it would not have these flow downs. There may be other things you want to include in there. As I mentioned, specific aspects of the prime contract in terms of contract performance you'd want to mention in there too, but you definitely want to have these flow downs. So you can do it a couple different ways. You can actually copy and paste in the clauses from the prime contract, or sometimes more efficient way is you actually just include portions of the prime contract. Maybe you redact out certain cost information or other information that doesn't need to go to the subcontractor, and you include those relevant portions of the prime contract that have these specific provisions as an attachment or exhibit to the prime contract. And if you kind of reference them, incorporate them by reference in the in the subcontract, that can be an effective way to reference all of those required clauses. And then those clauses will then say that the subcontractor has to flow them down to lower tier subcontractors. In that way, you're meeting those requirements as a prime, while sort of being efficient as possible. So you can't just use a regular commercial subcontract because it's not going to include those specific flow down clauses. Okay, go to the next slide. And then we'll kind of end up here with a few best practices. Of course, this isn't telling you everything to do in a subcontract in the scope of this webinar, but leave you with a few best practices here. You want to be specific. I think you kind of noticed that theme both in the teaming agreement and in the subcontract. The subcontractor scope of work and the subcontract, even more so than the teaming agreement, has to be specific. What is that subcontractor actually going to be doing? What are the rates they're going to be paid at? What labor categories are going to be included in there? Is it going to be a certain number of hours on a weekly basis or monthly basis? Is it going to be certain deliverables? Some people just take actual deliverables from the prime contract and they say these are the ones the sub is responsible for. Sometimes you may have to kind of subdivide it and come up with new ways to describe that, so it kind of makes sense from the subcontractor's perspective because you're sort of slicing and dicing parts of the prime contract, but being specific and making it fit the actual work you're doing is very important, so that there's not disputes later on, or at least if there is disputes, you can kind of point to the subcontract scope of work and say, well, here's the concern here. And of course, from the subcontractor's perspective, you've got to be careful in reviewing those to make sure they meet your understanding of what you have to do, what you're able to do, and kind of the timing and other aspects to make sure you can meet all those. And then payment is also a very important thing you want to include in your subcontract. I mentioned already invoicing. The prime's going to have very specific rules for invoicing, so a subcontractor has to either be aware of those or in some cases ask for a little bit of a flexibility or negotiate a slightly different way. Timing on the payment, and then basis of payment in terms of, obviously, if it's going to be a fixed price versus cost reimbursable, that just by necessity has to be mentioned somewhere in your subcontract. So again, this is not everything that should go into a subcontract, but some of those big picture items, so that, if you're a proposed sub and you get somebody shoots you over a really long subcontract, at a minimum, you need to look at these things. You should of course read the entire subcontract, and feel free to ask questions to that prime if you're not sure about why provisions are in there, or if you have ways that you want it to be altered. Make sure you're kind of voicing those things and talking to your prime and negotiating those things, because the worst that can happen is they don't agree with you, but you want to get those things out in the open at the time before you sign that subcontract and not have to worry about it later. All right, and then we'll go to the next slide. And thank you so much. There's our contact information. I'll put a brief mention of our newsletter here. If you like to get updates about federal contracting, that information is there.
Thank you, Shane and Jackie. We just had a few questions that I wanted to address. One of them was to you, Jackie, regarding if you offer mentorship.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I do to individuals, and it just, and it depends on what they need. There are also several mentorship programs, VA having one as well, SBA having several. So, but if there's anyone, I think there's my email, there's my information. So if you are interested in specific type of mentoring, please feel free to email me, and I will personally help you or help you get into a mentoring program that's best for you.
Thank you, Jackie. And then there was a question, I can direct it to you or Shane. They said, can a teaming agreement be 50-50?
Well, and then I'll let Shane give the legal answer. But to me, it depends, right? If you're similarly situated and that's what you negotiate, that's fine. But if there's socioeconomics involved, I always make it more than 50-50. I believe legally it's 50-50. I always make it 51 or 52 as a minimum, so that we don't have to worry about issues later. I think, but that's the only time, you can speak to this, Shane, that I'm aware of that it can be 50-50 is if you're similarly situated. Actually, I think it can be 50-50 even if you're not, but I don't think it's a good practice, just me personally. Give that 1 or 2% space in there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, you can make it that the limitation on subcontracting for services does say subcontract no more than 50%. So you could suggest right up to the line, but I think it's a better practice to maybe give a little bit of buffer for that small business. That is, if it's a small business set aside. You know, if it's a large business set aside and you're a small business sub, then you kind of got, you know, subcontracting plans and a different thing. You don't have to follow the limitation on subcontracting. That's only if it's a small business prime on a small business set aside. So do keep that in mind. You could go 50-50, but I think better practice is what Jackie suggested.
Thank you, Shane. And then the last question that we're going to ask is, can additional partners be added to your partner teaming agreement after it was already signed and agreed to by both teaming partners?
From an operational perspective, absolutely. You know, it all depends on, I honestly did that recently where we had agreed on the work shares and, you know, all the work shares were given out. It was 100%. However, we needed another sub again in order to solidify our win. They had business intelligence. None of us had. So we made room, we all agreed and made room for that partner. We all gave up 5% here, 10% here, and renegotiated the agreements. So as long as everyone is in agreement, absolutely. It's just a matter of all being in agreement to do that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'd agree with that. Very good answer.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It is 3:01. I'm going to end this presentation. Again, I want to thank you, Jackie, and you, Shane, for attending today and speaking and providing all this valuable information to the businesses. For those individuals that still have questions unanswered, I will get back to you towards the end of this week. So allow me about 2 business days and you'll start receiving emails answering your questions. For everyone that was in the chat networking with each other, the email that I will send out tomorrow with the presentation will include the chat so that you can have everyone's information. You didn't have to worry about writing it down or remembering. So I'm going to go ahead and end this chat and thank you everyone for attending. Also, quick survey. After this training concludes, can you please complete the survey? We use this as part of our continual service improvement. So everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.